Okay, let's start now. Good afternoon and welcome to the LSE South Asia Center. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar and I am Deputy Director here at the Center. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this afternoon's event in our regular series of Thursday events. This afternoon's event is in collaboration with LSE Library, and we are very happy to do a second event. We did one last year, about which I'll speak very briefly. The event this afternoon is titled Traces of History, Fragmentary Archives and Narratives in South Asia. And what we are going to do, the way in which we've planned this event, is that the event is actually going to be in two parts. Two of my colleagues from the library are going to first speak about about South Asia related archives in the collections of the LSE Library. And then we have two scholars who will speak on the challenges of writing history or narratives where you have to use archival sources, but archival sources that are not continuous and that are not, there is not an abundance of it. They're often patchy, they're dotted. And we, as scholars, all of us have to find ways to narrativize from these insufficient and incomplete archives to be able to tell a convincing and a verifiable story. So, but a bit more on that just now, because the principal question, and it's important that I mention that the thoughts that went into curating this event this afternoon came from the position that this is a situation that confronts a lot of scholars, not just historians. Professor Niraja Gopal Jayal is a political scientist, but not just historians, but a lot of social scientists who use archives and then have to write on the basis of that. And it is important that whatever we write and whatever we publish is, in fact, cross-verifiable in retrospect by other academics and scholars to underpin the veracity of what we have all said in our narratives. We will hear much more about this, but before that, I have an announcement to make, which is that unfortunately, Professor Shahid Amin is unable to join us this afternoon because Professor Amin has been taken slightly unwell and has been asked to rest. And that's a bit of information that I've got just in the last half an hour, 40 minutes. So we were unable to send an email to all the attendees. So please accept my apologies. Please also accept Professor Shahid Amin's apologies, which he wishes to be conveyed, because he was really looking forward to it, as was I. He was my teacher when I was a student at the University of Delhi. Before I introduce, we have a wonderful panel today to discuss all this, but before I introduce our panel, a few things to say for the benefit of the audience. First, a very warm welcome to all of you. Several of you have been in touch with me. You are watching this from across time zones, literally from across the world, across the globe. So thank you very much for your interest. We do these events as much to learn as to engage with our audiences whom we cannot reach. And I always say this in all the online events that I do, that if there's one good thing that has come out of the pandemic, it is that we are able to do so many events online. The event is happening via Zoom and is being live streamed on YouTube, which is where all of you are watching it. You will see that the chat function has been enabled in YouTube. That is for all of you as members of the audience to ask questions. Please feel free to ask questions. If you would like to pose a question to a particular speaker, then please mention that in your question. You're equally welcome to pose a question to the panel. And I will then read out your question and ask panelists to respond to it. If you would like to tweet, then please do tweet and tag at @SAsiaLSE. The Twitter handles, the relevant Twitter handles, all appear in the notes to the speakers on your screens on YouTube. So you should be able to find the Twitter handles over there. So please do tag us. And I should add over here, for the benefit of those who may not have attended an earlier event of ours, or who may not have attended events at the London School of Economics earlier, that in keeping with the on-site rules of events at the LSE, members of the audience are entitled to ask questions without revealing their names or their identities, and you are very welcome to do so. On YouTube, I know that when you pose a question, depending on how you've registered your YouTube account, your name will show. But when I read out the question, I will not take anyone's names. I will simply pose the question without taking names. I know that your name is visible, but at least we remain close to the spirit. Before I introduce the panelists, a very big thank you to LSE Library for this collaboration and this event, which has been in the planning for a very, very long time. And as you will see, my colleagues will show you a web page which shows how long they've been working at it. This is the second event. Last year, we did a very successful event on Ambedkar. You can find the details of that on our website, on the South Asia Center's website, as well as on the LSE Library's webpage as well. It is now my very pleasant task to introduce the speakers. We've had a quick chat before we came live to you, and the order in which I introduce the speakers is the order in which they will speak now. Speakers will make initial comments, and then we will have a discussion, and you are welcome to pose questions, and I will pose questions on your behalf to all of them. Our first speaker is Daniel Payne, who is Curator for Politics and International Relations at the London School of Economics' Library. In 2021, Daniel curated Educate, Agitate, Organize, Ambedkar and LSE, an online exhibition that is based on documents in the LSE Library. And please do see that web page, because apart from other things, you can actually download the entirety of Dr. Ambedkar's student file. You can still do it. I have just checked it just now, so you can do it. And it really is quite an interesting read of about 60 odd pages of documents and letters and so on and so forth. Dr. Gillian Murphy will speak next. Gillian is Curator for Equality, Rights and Citizenship at the LSE Library and promotes the Women's Library Collection and the Hall-Carpenter archives. Antoinette Burton is Maybelle, Leland, Swanlund Endowed Chair Professor in the Department of History at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. A historian of the 19th and 20th centuries of Britain and Empire, Antoinette is editor of Archive Stories, Facts, Fictions, and the Writing of History, which was published in 2005, amongst several other publications. I mentioned this one only because it is directly related to the event this afternoon. Niraja Gopal Jayal is Avantha Chair Professor at King's College London and Centennial Professor in Gender Studies at the London School of Economics. Niraja is currently writing a biography of Hansa Mehta, for whom archival evidence is sparse, as well as there is this whole question of a connection with LSE, which we are all spending time trying to decipher. Niraja is the author of Citizenship and Its Discontents, which was published in 2013, and Reforming India, the Nation Today, of which he was editor in 2019, apart from other publications. I'm now going to invite Daniel to speak, and we'll take it from there. Daniel, you have about 10 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much, Landon, and thanks very much for the invitation to speak. So I'm going to talk about a new project that Leland just briefly introduced, a new webpage on the library web pages, which seeks to foreground some of the stories that we have to do with South Asia, specifically in the archives and special collections at the library. I'm going to introduce one of the stories in particular that I've been working on recently, and then also I'll talk a little bit about the background behind why we're doing that page in the first place. The first thing I wanted to mention was the question that Leland raised in the subtitle of this event, which I'm just going to read so I make sure I say it correctly. He asked, how do we write academic narratives when the archives are fragmentary with traces connected by gaps? I think this is a really, really interesting question to me, because it's not just the case that archives themselves, the kind of sources of evidence that you're looking for, are fragmentary, but also the process by which they're organized, which means the practice of archiving, cataloging, and archive catalogs, that can contribute to that fragmentation. But they're a bit of a double-edged sword, because the archives catalog is also what makes access possible. So it can sometimes obscure things, but is also necessary to make access possible. To give a kind of obvious example, if you're not searching for an archive, but something ordinary like a published book, you would go to probably a library catalogue or a bookshop website and just search for the title. And it either has the book or it doesn't. It's kind of unequivocal. If it says the book's not there, it's because they don't have it, unless you've misspelled the title. But what's different about an archive catalogue is that you might come to it searching for a particular kind of evidence, and the catalogue might indicate that we don't have it, but that might not be the case. We might actually have it. Likewise, it might indicate that we do have it, or that there's something very interesting to your research, but it turns out that we don't have it. And many people that are involved in archival research will be very familiar with having to come into an archive, perhaps spending days or even weeks looking through lots and lots of things, just to establish whether something is there or whether it isn't. So that's a kind of speaks about the complexity of archive catalogues. I should say I'm actually not an archivist, so I work very closely with archives. I use them daily, but I don't actually do the practice of cataloguing. But I think there's a couple of things worth stating about how a catalogue is produced that can kind of contribute to this problem sometimes of obscuring things. One in particular is the very hierarchical way in which archives are catalogued. So they're catalogued in kind of levels. It's a top-down kind of approach. If you imagine an inverted tree structure, an upside-down tree. And we have the archives of Peter Shaw as an example. So he's a Labour MP. And right at the very top level, these are archived as the papers of Peter Shaw. And then everything in that collection is catalogued at sort of progressively narrower levels that all sit beneath this kind of overarching structure, which are the papers of Peter Shaw. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is because it means that collections are always catalogued with a particular frame of reference, this being the Peter Shaw archives. It might mean that you as a researcher think, I don't have any interest in Peter Shaw, but it could be the case that there's this fragment, this random item somewhere in that hierarchy that actually is very, very relevant to your research. It's just not necessarily impossible to find, but can be obscured by this sort of hierarchical different frame of reference to the researchers. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning is about the writing of the description on a catalogue. So if we think of, say in the Peter Shaw collection, the archivist has a file that contains 10 letters, and the archivist now has to summarize the contents of that file and write that summary. And this is what the researcher will search for when they come to search on an archives catalogue. Of course, they can't write a full transcription word for word that covers everything that are in those letters. So it necessarily involves summarizing. And summarizing necessarily involves exclusion. So they'll always pick out subjects and voices that, according to their own kind of subjective experience, these descriptions can vary quite widely between different places for lots of different reasons. Kind of, maybe there's a very large cataloging backlog, so it can't be a very detailed description, for example. But the reason I mention this is to say that sometimes, in some cases, perhaps particularly with a collection that's been catalogued a very long time ago, these descriptions can tend to favour already more dominant voices. They mention what's already more dominant, and then might not mention more minority voices. And so that very action kind of contributes to the further minoritizing of already minoritized voices in the description of the archives catalogue. So I'm mentioning all of that just to say that I think when thinking about how the academic writes and how the researcher produces an academic narrative from fragmentary archives, I think the archivist and the curator, which is me, and all the people involved, like in the archive space that arrange for your access to come in and see things, I think all of us together do actually play quite a big role in shaping what the researcher ends up seeing, which I think is something kind of worth stating. And that brings me onto the project. I'm going to try sharing my screen whilst talking at the same time, which is a bit difficult. So host only, and so I'm not talking whilst I'm doing it. Here we go. So Gillian, if you could just do a thumbs up if you can see the screen. You can, great. Okay. So this new project is to try to find these fragments of archives that relate to, say, South Asia and might be amongst sort of an existing hierarchy, and bring them together in these stories that we try and put together. So this is the story that I've been working on recently, and what it started with was a letter inside the papers of Lionel Robbins. So Lionel Robbins was an economist at LSE and a professor. And there was a letter written by one of his former students called Vital Kadam. And this letter is addressed to Robbins, and he's asking for help to find another job. So in this letter, it seems that after graduating, he was working at a job in India, also tutoring, I think, in economics. And the conditions are not great. It sounds like he's overworked and he's very anxious about his situation. And he writes to Lionel Robbins asking for help in getting another job. And there's a couple of letters in the collection back and forth between the two of them. And it seems that Lionel Robbins tried to get him another job and didn't. And then that's where the story ends. I think that's another common thing about archives, particularly when you're looking at traces and not, the papers of Peter Shaw. We know what happened to Peter Shaw. But in these instances, you kind of jump to the middle of a story and you don't know what happens next, which is why we try to piece together and find out what happened next. So one thing I did was have a look to see if there are any student files. So student files are just a collection of administrative documents that relate to a student's study here, and they're normally quite dull and uninteresting. And they're catalogued, I believe, it just says their name and the year that they studied, so it doesn't list every item that's inside the file because that would take too long. And in this particular file, I found lots of interesting things. So this is a picture of him in his publication. I'm just scrolling down a little bit. Here are some of the letters that I mentioned. And I found some other letters that turned out to be written by Ambedkar. Just trying to find ones a little bit further down. I was remembering here is, no, that's his application. From here is one of the letters. So it was quite exciting to discover a letter from Ambedkar because it's kind of hidden in the student file. It's not something that we knew about previously. And it seems that Ambedkar was responsible for a scholarship where he would arrange for Dalit students to come and spend a period of time studying abroad. And this is how he arranged this for the students to come to LSE. That still didn't tell me what had happened to Kadam after this and how he solved the problem of getting a better job. And in a long-winded way, which we'll just have to read the exhibition later, I ended up getting in touch with his former employee who shared lots of memories with me about Kadam, and then through him, his son. And so we pieced them together in this exhibition, which tries to make something out of trace an archive. I think that was pretty much exactly 10 minutes. So that's me finished, and I hand back to Leland.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That was great. I think you're going to keep the screen on because Gillian is going to speak, but I just wanted to briefly reintroduce Gillian for those of members of our audience who've just joined since I did the initial introductions. Dr. Gillian Murphy is Curator for Equality, Rights and Citizenship at LSE Library. Gillian promotes the Women's Library Collection and the Hall-Carpenter Archives. Gillian, please speak now.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to talk about the print collection of the Women's Library as it relates to South Asia. And I thought it might be quite interesting to say a few words about how I put this webpage together. So I'm going to start with She magazine, which is which is towards the bottom of the page. Okay, that's it. So I found this magazine by browsing the shelves of in the vault, which is one of the perks of the job, and it was for a student group that was coming in to look at women's print media in general. And this magazine piqued my interest because of its format, the fact that it was printed in Karachi, and it had very progressive articles inside them. So I tried to find out more information about this magazine, and I couldn't. I assumed it was an offshoot of the She magazine that is printed in the UK. So I couldn't find any information about this magazine. So I contacted an academic who worked in periodicals, and she then sent me an article about Zura Karim, who had died in 2019. And in this article, it said things about setting up this magazine, and it gave information about her parents, that she was a student at LSE, didn't give the dates of when she was at LSE, and that Karim was the surname of her second husband. So the next stage was to find her student file, and with the help of an archivist, we pinned it down to this one file. I had an idea that it might have been the 50s. I thought the late 50s, that she was at LSE. Anyway, so we pinned it down to, so we found the file, I should say. And there's a story around the way name changes happen, and spellings of surnames and spellings of first names as well. So trying to find people in the archive can be tricky as well. So we found the student file. She had been at LSE in the early 1950s, and she had graduated in 1953 with an economics degree. And in the file, it said, there was a note to say that she had wanted to go back to Pakistan, and that she had wanted to get a job using her economics degree. So the next part of this, this webpage involved me searching for books, pamphlets, and periodicals that are printed in South Asia or are related, or that relate to South Asia in the Women's Library, using the library catalogue. And I asked one of the librarians to pull this information out of the catalogue and to put it into a spreadsheet, so that people could use this information. You know, you can filter the spreadsheet, you can download it. If you just move up the page, Daniel, please. Thank you. Oh, it's just down. It doesn't really matter. Anyway, it's just a spreadsheet. There it is. So then, what interested me in these library catalogue entries was there was no obvious mention of the Sad Brown Library. And I knew that these books existed because I had some on my desk and I had this book plate. So the information is there in the catalogue, but it's hidden. Now, I think, I mean, my background's in archives, I've worked as an archivist, and I'm not a librarian, but I do think that it's important to know the provenance of a library, and the Women's Library is a library of libraries. So for this reason, I start the page by talking about the Sad Brown Library, and I'm going to say a few words about that now. So the Sad Brown Library was set up by the British Commonwealth League in 1938 in the memory of Myra Sad Brown, who had died that year. And she was a campaigner. She was active in the militant campaign in the British suffrage campaign for the vote. She went to prison. You can read her prison letters in the archive. She was also an internationalist. She worked with the International Alliance of Women, and she also helped to set up the British Commonwealth League in 1925. Now, the remit of the library was to collect print material on women's rights in the Commonwealth countries. And the Sad Brown Library was a discrete collection until the 1990s, when it was integrated into the main collection of the Women's Library. But the books were to have a book plate and a red sticker on the spine, so they were identifiable on the shelves. But the red sticker has long gone, but we still do have the book plates. and we still do add to the collection. So her granddaughter, Myra Sabrown's granddaughter, just emailed me with suggestions of books to buy. So now if you ever use any of these books from the Sabrown Library, you will know something about the history of that library. Okay, that's all I'm going to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Gillian. That was great. I'm sure we'll come back to some of this. Daniel, I'm going to now invite Professor Burton, but when Professor Jayal speaks, I wondered if it would be possible to show the page on Hansa Mehta, just so members of the audience can see that. That'll be great if that's possible and it's not too much trouble. But I'm now going to introduce Antoinette Burton once again. Antoinette Burton is Maybelle, Leland, Swanlund Endowed Chair Professor in the Department of History at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. A historian of 19th, 20th century Britain and Empire, Antoinette is editor of Archive Stories, Facts, Fictions, and the Writing of History, which was published in 2005, amongst much else. Antoinette, please speak now. You have about 10 minutes.
Great, thank you. And thanks so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be in this great company. The invitation to participate in this panel really resonated with me because I've spent most of my career grappling with the question of how to write histories of people and subjects whose archival presence has been elusive at best. In my case, histories of women, most often women of South Asian descent and in diaspora, and other subjects from below. So in my time allotted, I'm going to try to do three things. The first is to speak to the history of engagements with archives and their fragments for women's history through some aspects of my own intellectual autobiography. Second, I'm going to suggest some ways I've used alternative sources to reconstruct aspects of women's nationalist and colonial histories. And third, I'll end by pointing to an emerging genre of history writing, critical fabulations, which aims to weave narratives from hard research and scattered facts in order to represent that which is often elusive, even fugitive when it comes to women's experiences. So first off, at the beginning of my career as a historian, first as a graduate student at the University of Chicago in the 1980s, and later as a teacher and researcher in a variety of institutional settings, these questions were new questions, and they were often irritants for established scholars. When I did my PhD at Chicago, women's history was not yet a field. This is the mid-'80s. When I told my advisor I wanted to write an intellectual history of one of Britain's earliest suffrage thinkers, Millicent Garrett Fawcett, he asked me, did she have any actual ideas? In the end, I didn't write about her because I got interested in women in empire, specifically with respect to South Asia. But the landscape of the 1980s and 1990s is dotted with many similar stories. Archivists at the then India Office Library in London, which some may recall was housed south of the Blackfriars Bridge, were both skeptical and disdainful of my quest, and they exerted very little energy to help me navigate the card catalog to find women as subjects, let alone women themselves. Luckily, I ultimately found a place where at least nominally women were the subject of the archive. That's the Fawcett Library, housed for many years at the East London Polytechnic, and now in the Women's Library, one of those library of libraries at the LSE. There I was able to dig into a vast set of records that privileged white feminists and in which Indian women as subjects independent of the Western gaze were very hard to find in that space. Of course, in the 1980s and 1990s, the subject of the limits of the archives, the very subject of the limits of the archive was on the minds of subaltern studies scholars who brought the fragment as a conceptual and methodological problem to the fore. Though not usually acknowledged, women's and feminist historians were also grappling with this challenge to traditional historical knowledge making. Of course, many of you will know Gayatri Spivak's famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, which raised these questions. In my own work, I have tended to draw more on her earlier essay published in History and Theory in 1985 called The Rani of Sirmoor, which in a different form became the much cited Can the Subaltern Speak? I prefer The Rani of Sirmoor because it names the elusive, fugitive subject herself, and in so doing takes direct aim at the Western discipline of history, which encourages us to fetishize the official archive in search of subjects who were never meant to be subjects. In this case, thanks to the patriarchal bargain struck between elite colonial men and imperial officials in the context of the Raj. In the wake of my dissertation and first book, I was already thinking about these challenges and working through some of the questions, most notably perhaps in my book, Dwelling in the Archive. There, I rematerialized 3 Indian women writing in English, Janaki Majumdar, Cornelia Sarabji, and Atiya Hussain, using a combination of primary sources, family history, correspondence, and a novel, Atiya Hussain's Sunlight on a Broken Column. Some of these sources were archivally held. Sarabji's raft of letters from her time, especially when she was a student at Oxford in the early 1890s, are held in the India Office Library. So some of the sources were archivally held and some were not. Janaki Majumdar's family history was in the house of her grandson in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, where I happened to have grown up and where my mother lived and knew the family. So it's a very random encounter with this incredibly rich family history written in Janaki's hand and given to me over tea. So the archive is a very mobile place and often can be found outside of official institutions. I used mixed methods in that book, and I really tried to use Atiya Hussain's novel as a social history, as an archival space for disembedding some of the unspoken and challenging intimate histories of South Asia at that time. I also have written about Santha Rama Rao, who was the daughter of the famous Dandavati Rama Rao, and also Phyllis Naidu, who was a person living in South Africa of South Asian descent. In both cases there, I used a combination of interviews with the women, both now sadly gone, their correspondence and print material that they had written, as well as archival fragments like letters and clippings to reconstruct what I could of their lives. In the case of Phyllis Naidu, I traveled to Durban to meet her. I spent hours in her apartment talking with her and looking at the archives of photographs of fallen anti-apartheid warriors on her wall. And I looked at her papers in the Gandhi Luthuli Center in Durban. Again, I also relied on her written work to reconstruct some of the parameters of her political life. In both of these cases, Santha Rama Rao and Phyllis Naidu, I forswore biography, which in its conventional form, I think, fetishizes a life account that is often not possible to reconstruct for anything but truly preeminent subjects. So my book on Santha Rama Rao was called The Post-Colonial Careers of Santha Rama Rao, tracking one aspect of her trajectory. And in Phyllis's case, she got a very long chapter in my book, Africa and the Indian Imagination. My account of her there was very much tacked to the tense and tender ties between Africans and people of South Asian descent in the Cold War global South. So I want to end on maybe a more optimistic note. Of all the historians seeking to write from fragments, it's historians of Africa-descended women under slavery, after emancipation, under Jim Crow and beyond in the US, who I think have been the most inventive and tenacious when it comes to upending archival conventions. Black scholars like Saidiya Hartman in her book Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, and Taya Miles in her book All That She Carried have broken new ground in this space, helping to envision a genre coming to be called critical fabulations in some circles, a form of creative semi-nonfiction that attempts to bring the suppressed voices of the past to the surface by means of that hard research and scattered facts that I referred to at the start. Taya Miles calls for an abundant approach to history, resisting the default in which historical gaps feed contemporary forgetfulness. And she expressly calls on us to read the archive diagonally, against and along the biased grain, citing Marisa Fuente's imperative that we stretch with and against available sources to recapture the histories of the historically disempowered, and that's in Fuente's book, Dispossessed Lives. For these scholars, the urgency of a new politics of methodology, one rooted in the conviction that in addition to what we tell, the way we tell what we may not know with total certainty also matters. That politics is clear. They model a refusal of the limits of both the official archive and of history, capital H. The kinds of history writing they practice have the capacity to reframe the past, make unseen histories visible, and reach new audiences as well. Rebecca Hall calls this practice the measured use of historical imagination, in part to hang on to the right to use history on her own terms, in order to imagine what could have happened by blending novel, memoir, and family history in graphic form. And that's her book, Wake, The Hidden History of Women-Led Save Revolts. Led by the example of Black scholars and historians of enslavement, we might consider developing provocations that reset the narrative and methodological premises. Empirically minded, extractive, and effectively imperialist, which continue to govern so much history writing today. We might play with form to split the seams of conventional history, to prize its binding open so that it accommodates subjects either unseen or recessed. In so doing, the hope is that we might meet the challenges of the contemporary moment with new forms of storytelling, that we might ask readers to think again about what biography looks like, or how history, capital H, can escape the limits of the archive. In this sense, grappling creatively with archival bits and fragments actually advances what we mean and do with history, even as we propel it into a more transparent and reflexive frame. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely awesome. We are going to come back to a lot of this, because one of the very important issues that has come across, and you use the word semi-nonfiction, it's also brings us to the question of genres. And while in my position as chair of this event, it is not my place to talk about my own research, but I will refer to something that I'm doing at the moment, which actually started from a single footnote in a book that I was reading, and is now turned into this 27,000 word Leviathan. It's very, very closely linked to the whole question of genre that you've been talking about. But may I please invite now Niraja Gopal Jayal, who is Avantha Chair Professor at King's College London and Centennial Professor in Gender Studies at LSE. Niraja is currently writing a biography of Hansa Mehta, for whom archival evidence is sparse, especially for her time at LSE, which is where we understood Hansa Mehta to have studied briefly. Niraja is author of Citizenship and Its Discontents, which was published in 2013, and Reforming India, The Nation Today, which was published in 2019, amongst other things. Niraja, before you begin, I have asked Daniel to share his screen and show your blog on Hansa Mehta, which was published on our center's blog towards the end of when you're speaking, if that's fine. So if you speak, and at some point, Daniel will show the blog just for the benefit of the audience so they can see, and they'll also get to see a photograph of hers. Yeah, please speak now. You have about 10 minutes.
Thank you, Nilanjan, and thank you. All these are hard acts to follow. Let me, I thank you for having me here, and I do feel like an imposter, not being a historian. My engagement with archival resources has been limited, occasional, and nowhere near as deep or rigorous as that of a respectable historian would be, with the minor caveat here that my very first book was, it was titled Indian Diary, The Indian Diary of Sydney and Beatrice Webb, which I found as a student in the Webb papers at the LSE Library, I think around 1980. And it was published, edited, annotated, and with an introduction by me, by OUP in, I don't even remember, possibly 1982, so a very long time ago. My recent engagement with the archive, as you mentioned, Nilanjan, is on account of this biography that I am venturing to write, and I have never written a biography before, of Hansa J. Mehta, 1897 to 1995. Why does she merit, who was she and why does she merit a biography? In the 1940s, Hansa Mehta made 3 important contributions. As one of 15 members of India's Constituent Assembly, and in line with her earlier work in the All India Women's Conference, she was a fierce advocate of women's rights to equality in education, property, marriage, and so on. Secondly, As India's representative to the UN Commission on Human Rights from 1946 onwards, she single-handedly secured the gender-neutral phrasing of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. In other words, all human beings are equal rather than all men are equal, 1948. And finally, as the Vice Chancellor of MS University Baroda, she made innovations that made the university a really prominent university, one of the first rank. Thereafter, however, she seems to have spent close to 3 decades in retirement as a private citizen, and almost nothing is known about those years of her life, barring whatever little I have managed to glean from interviews. I found that while there is a fair amount of archival material on Hansa Mehta's work, there is surprisingly little about her life. Not even personal letters to other public figures, materials that I seek because I think they would humanize her. They would enable me to see her as a person instead of a position or a role, however ably or impressively that role is discharged. So we're told that she sailed to London in 1919 to study at the LSE. During the pandemic, I reached out to Heather Dawson and Daniel Payne at the LSE Library, and they were incredibly helpful. They dived into the LSE archive to look for Hansa Behn's student file, but alas, no records were found. The historical records of the University of London that Daniel shared confirmed that she did not graduate, even if she might have attended. Her husband, however, the man she subsequently married, Dr. Jivraj Mehta, who was a physician, is listed in those records of the University of London as having got his MBBS in 1912 and his MD in 1914. As for Hansa, we have no idea what she did at university. We don't even know where she lived. And I'm happy to say more about my sleuthing on that issue later. All we know is that a meeting with Sarojini Naidu in London led her into the suffragist movement, and she became part of an unofficial Indian women's delegation to the 8th conference of the International Woman Suffragist Alliance in Geneva in June of 1920. Now, the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library in Delhi has the Hansa Mehta papers, voluminous, as also an interview she gave to the Oral History Project there. And these are largely about her participation in the national movement and her time at the United Nations. The Cambridge South Asia Archive has an interview. The National Archives of India has her reporting to the Indian government from the UN. The Geraldine Forbes collection at the British Library has a few pages. They relate entirely to her AIWC role. I am yet to visit, so I should mention that, this is work in very early stages yet. I'm yet to visit the Maharashtra State Archive, the Baroda Records Room, the All India Women's Conference papers at Teen Murti, but I'm reasonably confident that whatever I find will not be very different from what I found so far. It's interesting that at Cornell University, where many members of her family studied, the archivist has shared some snippets about her children and contacts to her grandchildren, and that is about the size of it. I am in touch with members of her extended family, but they're relatively young and therefore they have very faint memories of her. Now, even as I contend with these gaps, I am grappling also with the question of how to interpret the silence of the archive. Daniel's remarks, opening remarks, led me to wonder whether the archive is actually silent or simply, as one of you said, hidden. Is it that what appears not to be there isn't actually there? That's a question to which I hope to find an answer someday. But in the meantime, I am looking at this as the silence of the archive, and I'm wondering about how to interpret it. So first I ask myself, did Hansa Mehta not think it terribly important to reveal herself in ways that a biographer might want? This would be consistent with the completely private life she led for the last 3 decades of her existence, consistent also with the ethic of living simply and treating personal events as trivia of no interest to others outside one's private circle. That seems to have been the kind of ethic that she and Dr. Mehta had. But she has, on the other hand, recorded fragments of reminiscences mostly in Gujarati, so presumably for a local public. These relate to her days at college or her solo visit as a student to the US in 1921 or 22. There's a collection of her own writings about women's issues published in her own name in the 1980s, but this was edited by someone else. In keeping with the family tradition, she came from a very distinguished literary family, the family tradition of literary writing, and it suggests a kind of intriguing interest in theatre. She wrote plays in Gujarati and translated Shakespeare into Gujarati, but we don't know whether that interest in theatre went beyond this. So as a biographer, the silence of the archive leads me to confront an ethical question. If she did not authorize documents relating to her private life to be placed in the archives, she did authorize her papers to be placed in the Nehru Memorial Museum and Archive. If she didn't authorize documents relating to her private life to be placed in the same archive, must I, am I obliged to respect the implied privacy of that exclusion by not researching those aspects and confining myself to writing about her contributions to public life? This echoes, in a sense, what Professor Burton just said. For instance, there are anecdotes from family members that appear endearing to me, but might they be diminishing from her perspective? Should I empathetically imagine her disapproval as if she was listening in on them and practice the same reticence? How does one know if she would or would not want her life in its fullness to be presented to the world, even if it's possible to do such a thing, which it probably isn't? One also wonders if such silences, if they are authored by the individual herself, are inflected and in what way by gender differences. Do women tend to maintain silence about their private lives, care work, the bearing and rearing of children, and so on, because they consider it trivial or unimportant, or because they want to draw attention only to their achievements in public life? Contrariwise, is it male vanity that accounts for the often vast quantities of materials that men leave behind for their biographers? It's probably telling that the very first study of women members of the Constituent Assembly was only published a few weeks ago. And finally, is the silence of the archive a sign that Hansa Mehta fell into obscurity because the Times were thickly populated by tall nationalist leaders, mostly male, of course? She was an important, but by no means central figure in the national movement, and she seems to have receded quietly from public memory despite her stellar contributions. So what does her retrieval from those margins of history entail if the archives do not adequately support it, or, and as Antoinette Burton just said, should one simply forswear biography? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Niraja. Daniel is going to show the page, and my colleague is just, for the benefit of the audience, we are going to just paste the link to the page in the chat box for on YouTube for everyone in the audience to actually see it. But please do, this is for members of the audience, please do ask the questions, any questions that you would like to via the chat box, which is enabled. So you should be able to just type it in over there, and I will pose questions to each of you as they come in. But if I could just start off the discussion. Thanks, Daniel. That should be enough. We can now go back to our gallery mode, so everyone can. I'm going to begin with asking a question to both Antoinette and to Niraja. But before that, I cannot resist the temptation of saying that LSE has 3 buildings that are named Pethick, Lawrence, Fawcett, and what's the third one? Pankhurst. So I just wanted to say that this is just to say that, you know, I suppose it is absolutely fair and right to say that we have come a long way from where a lot of us began in the 70s and 80s to appreciating very openly and very confidently ways, names and historical figures that for various reasons have been less obvious in their public symbolisms. And this is going to bring me to a very important question that Nirja raised. And it actually goes back to something that I'd read a very, very long time ago in the 1990s. And both of you will definitely remember, Antoinette and Nirja, Leela Gandhi. And this actually comes from Leela Gandhi's PhD and she did her PhD in Shakespeare, and it was on monumentalization of women. And this goes back to Nirja's point about male vanity and the making of archives, and what we have available today as archives for us is that do we end up, despite our best intentions, do we end up writing about women, only those who are somehow visible in a predominantly male and masculine archive? That there is some sort of visibility that makes them. So for instance, I am writing a biography of the Queen Razia, precisely because in medieval sources, she gets mentioned very negatively by her contemporary historian, that she had all the positive attributes of a ruler, but in the books of God, she was born a woman. So, you know, this is the archive. All the sources for Razia come from men. And this is a very important thing. The other thing is, again, something that various people touched about, but it's also related to what Daniel said about Vitthal Kadam, is there a vicariousness involved in writing biographies on our part? As Nirja just said, that, you know, in trying to be a faithful and rigorous scholar and finding out as much information as possible, does one run the risk of saying things, revealing things that the person herself or himself may not have wanted? And if that be so, as scholars, should we actually take that into consideration? Or should we just go ahead and write what we want to write, because we are seeking to make information available for not only for our contemporaries, but also for posterity, because there is an element of vanity in writing history and publishing about it. Having said that, and I will come back to my footnote idea later on, if there is time. But the first question that I wanted to pose to Antoinette and to Nirja, and on the basis of what you've said, is how does it affect how we collate and narrativize fragmentary pieces of evidence, depending on the genre in which we are writing? So if we are writing, let's say, a history of the women's movement or a history of something versus the biography of an individual, does it or does it not? Because if we are writing about something that is more than an individual, and this is something I'm struggling with at the moment myself as well, you're able to pull in bits and pieces of information and evidence from other areas, and therefore actually texture that skeletal narrative more richly than you would be if you were just focusing on an individual. Antoinette, did you want to say something?
Oh, my Lord. Thank you. Those are all really important questions. And you also alluded to so many other issues in your setup that I hope we can get to. I think that there has to be a dialectic relationship between the evidence that we have and the genre that we inhabit. So you can arrive at the archive with the idea of writing something, a biography, a social history, a cultural history, and what you find in the archive or don't find in the archive or find elsewhere can and probably should dictate the form that you write it in, within reason. I mean, I think that we have to think of the genres, the disciplines as malleable. We have to inhabit them creatively so that they are, on the one hand, legible, obviously, to either academics or to other forms of marketplace. But we also have to, I think, articulate and practice a kind of faithfulness to the evidence that we have, because we don't actually get to write the kinds of histories and biographies that we wish we could. unless we push beyond the boundaries of the evidence that we have to hand. And that evidence is often revealed beyond our lifetimes. It's made available, it's discovered. But so we have to live in the space that we inhabit, and we have to be willing, I think, to push against the boundaries of the genres, but also think organically through the materials that we end up having. That would be my preliminary response.
Sure, thank you. Nirja, did you want to say anything to anyone?
I don't have very much to add. I mean, the point about vicariousness that you made, I think this is a genuine ethical dilemma. And I think every individual who's writing, every writer will approach it in the way I don't know yet how I will approach it. I have not yet reached the stage of writing. I'm still, at the very early stages, as I said, of collecting materials. But I think context is also important. What we are looking for in an archive also depends on where we stand today. So, for instance, all the writings about Hansa Mehta, there are little essays and so on written over the years through the 60s, 70s, in these sort of Indian women handbooks kind of volumes. Almost nowhere is much made of the fact that the gender-neutral phrasing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was her contribution. It's there in biographies of Eleanor Roosevelt, it's there in lots of other places, but that particular fact is not something that she talks about or others talk about or to have talked about for decades. It's only in today's context, when these sorts of things have begun to matter, that contribution is coming to the fore. So far, it's mainly scholars in international relations and so on who've noted it and flagged it and talked about it. But even for them, so for me as a reader of their works, it doesn't go far enough because it doesn't tell me who this person was and where this insistence was coming from. She had a lot of hard work to do in persuading that committee, the subcommittee that was formulating this declaration. She had a lot of hard work to do in persuading Roosevelt herself. But she managed to do it, and some of the things she's written tell you that it was a struggle. But the fact that she could insist on it was not just extraordinary and unusual for her time, but it's also unusual that she herself and none of her contemporaries made much of it thereafter. It's only now that we're beginning to pick it up. But we're not necessarily asking the question, which is what a biography may enable. I don't know. A biography may enable the asking of the question, where was this woman coming from? Where was this insistence coming from? What was the larger I don't want to use the word ideological, but the larger framing that facilitated, enabled, and made her push this to the extent that she did. So, yeah, I think that would be.
Can I reply?
Yeah, sure. If I can just say one thing before that, and I'm going to also ask Daniel to respond to the whole question of, vicarious. When I use the word vicarious, what I really meant was, this whole thing of being able to access descendants or relatives or co-workers, as opposed to, say, someone like me who's writing about a queen in the 13th century. But Nirja, in your case, there was one thing. I have had the enormous benefit of being able to read your blog and work on that document before we published it. And I was wondering, with the passage of time, in just the last 25 years, even the genre of biographical writings has evolved, historical biographical writings has evolved. And I was wondering, when you were making your initial remarks, is there no information at all from her about her traveling? Because for her time, and frankly, for many other times, she was a remarkably well-traveled woman.
I'm happy to answer that, but I think Antoinette had something to say. Do we want to let her go first?
It might relate. I think I really appreciate you're just saying, that your question is motivated by a contemporary context, broadly imagined, because the recent president of the American Historical Association issued a very interesting and controversial statement recently about how we need to forswear presentism and really focus on the past for its own sake. So I think those are dialectical tensions inside the profession of history itself, which are really interesting. But I guess motivated as you are by this question of what is the historical explanation for how this incredibly important intervention that she made has nonetheless been thoroughly overlooked. I mean, I think that is such a fabulous research question. And then the question that arises is, how do you reconstruct, let's say, the discursive universe in which such a incredibly today forward-looking intervention might have emerged? And that could lead you, that could exist in a biographical account. It could be a kind of byway for getting at an ultimately perhaps unanswerable question in terms of her literal address of it, but would be able to conjure, this what I'm calling a discursive universe in which such an intervention would have been thinkable. And that is super interesting as a research question. And I think it could be folded into a biographical approach, even as it might be a whole chapter, right? I mean, of that text. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. That's extremely helpful. So I get Nilanjan's question. Do you want me to answer that now?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, and then we'll bring Daniel in.
Okay, so on the travel, yes, I mean, many women, by the way, many Indian women traveled to Britain to study at that time, even before. There are, this book on doctors, for instance, from the late 19th century documents many such. And there are, Sarojini Naidu was there before Hansa Mehta was there, and she was at King's, as a matter of fact. So there were many women who traveled to study, but what's interesting about Hansa Mehta is the solo travel she undertook to the United States in about 21, 22 sometime. And she goes there, she spends about 8 months traveling up and down the United States, visiting educational. We don't actually know where exactly she went, and we don't have an itinerary. But what we do know is that she has written this herself. She's written an account in Gujarati of how she lands up and fetches up in New York, gets off this boat, and begins to, wait, looking for somebody who's supposed to receive her from some Carnegie Foundation or the other. And she looks around, there's no one there. The officials at the port, hand her over then, because nobody shows up for hours. They hand her over to someone who, I can't remember the name of that society. I think it's called the Traveller Society, it was called. It still exists. It has a slightly different name now, but it still exists. And they hand her over to this person. And she discovers, by the way, that the letter that she wrote to the Carnegie people was actually traveled on the same boat as herself. So obviously there would be no one there to meet her. So she fetches up, and then she's taken to a YWCA. And then what follows from her, she writes this little piece on how the YWCAs are these fantastic organizations. It's a national network, and these are the wonderful things they do. And then she's describing, every meal she's having there and who she's meeting through them and so on. She has a little travel piece on her. So she returned to India at the end of her travels, which again are a black hole, from San Francisco via Tokyo, Singapore, Shanghai, Singapore, Colombo, and then back to presumably Bombay. And she survives miraculously an earthquake in Tokyo, which she also writes about. But these are fragments. This is all we have. Other travels she's written about, travels within India, also in Gujarati, which I'm getting now translated. So yeah, those are the travels. But quite extraordinary for a young woman of that age to be sort of knocking around on her own in a strange country, and not very clear with what purpose.
Daniel.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really interesting question. I think you have to just turn off your sound, Gillian. Sorry, we're in the same room, so the sound issues. Yeah, when I was putting together the Kadam exhibition and trying to pursue the trail of where he ended up, I was thinking about the fact that he has no say in the fact that I'm memorializing him. I'm kind of unresolved in that question as to what the answer to that is. I got in touch with his family and somebody that used to work for him, and they shared with me lots and lots of memories about him. And I guess Kadam has no say in how he's being memorialized in this instance. but I have memorialized him anyway. I think it's just a sort of a judgment on what you decide to do. I sought the approval of the family and the employer, and I selected some memories from what they shared, which does put me in a position of power, I guess, because I kind of decide how he is remembered. It reminds me a bit of when I was speaking about archive catalogues to begin with, the way that a catalogue is kind of double-edged sword, because on the one hand it provides access, but on the other hand it kind of obscure. And in that kind of way, this memorializing is also double-edged, because it remembers somebody that doesn't seem to have otherwise been remembered. I couldn't find any reference to this person anywhere. But then it does sort of further add a layer to it where I am the one who's deciding how he's memorialized. Yes, I don't have a neat answer to that question, I think.
Okay, thank you. Once again, if anyone in the audience wants to ask a question, please do. But if you're not, then I have the joy of asking my own questions and posing questions. But I'm going to go back to the question of genre now, but from a different perspective. And that is based on actually a word that Nirja used fleetingly. And Antoinette, this is directed more to you. Both you and I are trained as historians, as it were, which is that when we get trained as historians, the only ethics that we are taught to follow is to refer to the archives faithfully and properly and try to see it in a context and make the archives speak in the manner in which they perhaps intended to speak as best as we can, etc., etc. Unlike other social science disciplines, anthropology, sociology, those that deal more with contemporary times, where there are actually very established research ethics of how you are going to conduct research on the field, etc. Now, with the passage of time, and I was very struck by the examples you were giving of the various books towards the end of your presentation, one of the things that you said was, and this was from one of the books that you quoted, was it's, as with everything else, one of the most important things is the way we tell. How we say what we've set out to say, because that opens up a very important question, which also refers to what Nirja said about feeling like an imposter because Nirja is not trained as a historian, is who are we writing this for? Because, as you know, one of the most important problems that trained historians have had is that they have written for the longest time and continue to write in turgid and near opaque language that only some other people understand. But there has also been a change, and there has also been a proliferation of different kinds of genres and styles of writing where historical sources and archives have been used in academic ways, in academically rigorous ways, but the way in which the story has then been told has been far more accessible than what, bog standard historians, the way in which they write. So the question of genre was not just about the history of a theme or a subject versus the history of a person. It's also about how we write, and that determines genre. You yourself have written, and I've read a lot of your works, you yourself have written actually on subjects that speak to a variety of audiences. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on this, because after this, the next question that I have in my mind actually refers to Gillian's presentation, because feminist writing and gender history, as we call it in history, has referred to it in the context of South Asia. I know I don't know about the rest of the world, to magazines, as it were. But as we refine and finesse our research tools and our ways of thinking, what are your thoughts on the importance of how we write, what we write, given that we are referring to archives?
Thank you. So let me take a few bites of that to start with. So I guess I want to acknowledge, coming off of the conversation that we just had, that we're all entering into in these conversations and evoking very large historiographies and other forms of literature around, let's say, Indian women traveling in diaspora, and the question of archives and how to write alternative history. So we are participating in a huge body of literature which has been grappling with these questions, let's say, for half a century. And I think to anyone out there who's listening who may have contributed to those or have studied those in their own training, I just want to acknowledge that these are huge kind of meta questions that many people have attempted to grapple with. I think I will say that history, capital H, in the West, has perhaps reached a kind of tipping point in terms of its legitimacy, because it has failed to really address its own role in excluding certain topics from counting as forms of historical knowledge. And those exclusions have most often been directed at women, colonial subjects, enslaved peoples, Dalit peoples, indigenous peoples. And so history, capital H, has a lot to account for. And it must break out of that kind of stricture of determining what counts as an archive. And it must move beyond the exclusive use of the official archive as the grounding of its legitimacy. Not to say supplanting it by other things, but juxtaposing. I said mixed methods in my remarks, and I think we have to mix it up. That's the only way we're going to get at histories beyond the conventional. I will end this piece by saying that I've written 6 monographs, and I love me a monograph, but those monographs do not reach the kinds of audiences, particularly students, that I'm interested in reaching with the kinds of histories about empire in particular that I'm interested in forwarding. And so I have used the ABC-darium form to address students. I wrote an ABC of Queen Victoria's empire, A to Z, starting with Afghanistan and ending with Zamzama. And I think that is a really interesting, creative way to enter. And all that is built on my deep archival and historical knowledge, but I'm turning it on a genre, the ABC, that may open up the possibility of grasping those histories to new audiences. And most recently, with my colleague Renisa Mawani at UBC, we did a bestiary, an anti-imperial bestiary. A is for ape, Z is for Zebu, and everything in between, in order to make an argument based on, we had many contributors, understandably, 26 letters in the alphabet. We had 19 contributors, including ourselves, to grapple with archival and other forms of primary evidence and represent them in ways that could be read in a linear fashion, but could also be dipped in and out of. And I think that is a historical practice of the kind, not everybody needs to do it, but we need to be thinking in those kinds of creative ways. And so I think biography has a similar kind of flexibility. As you were saying earlier, it's a genre that's had a lot of pressure put on it in recent years, and I think that it's malleable and it can be used to suit the purposes that you want, if that's how you choose to do it. So that would be my sort of the big questions.
Okay, I'm going to ask Nirja, but I'm first going to come to Gillian. But Nirja, one of the questions that I want to ask you that is related, because you began with making the point that you're not a historian, is given the books that you have written, Citizenship and its Discontents being one of the recent ones that a lot of us have read, I am very keen to hear how you decided on the tone to take about how to tell what you were going to tell. What is the mode in which you put your mind to be able to narrativize about someone in the past, irrespective of the archival patchiness or dottedness of it or whatever. But first to Gillian. Gillian, when you were speaking and you referred to Myra, of whom we also have a wonderful photograph on the website. Incidentally, I've pasted the link to the webpage in the YouTube's chat box. both to you, Gillian, and to Daniel, very briefly, if you will. How did you decide what tone to take when you decided to narrativize? That's one. The second is you have the advantage, unlike us, where academics and scholars come to you to talk to you. And I wondered whether you had any experiences of the kind, what kind of conversations you have with scholars who are seeking to search for these archives. I understand that the particular ones that we're talking about today are not that hugely used in LSE, but I wondered if you had something to say. If you don't, that's fine as well.
The tone that I took with the my webpage is very factual. So I just want to, my role is to promote the collection. So I want people to use it. So that's my role, is to be as factual as I can. I'm trying not to put an opinion on it. I could say a lot more about the library part of it and what they've done with bookmarks or book plates and all the rest of it. But yeah, and then when we have students come to us and academics who come to us, it's more about facilitating their use of the archive and trying to find ways of finding that information that they're looking for, because we might know how to manipulate the catalogue a little bit more than they do. Yeah, so Daniel, did you want to add any more to that?
Manipulate, I take in the best meaning of the word.
Sorry?
I said manipulate, I take in the best meaning of the word, because
yes, of course. Yeah, that was the wrong word. But how to use it in a more effective way.
Yeah, I was going to add. I was just going to add that if you have a look at Gillian's page compared to mine, I think they have different styles, but we're both aiming at the same thing, which is to be. We're trying as far as possible to be factual and opinionless. I think with mine, I was trying to be factual and opinionless about stating the journey with which I pieced together the story. I wanted to kind of expose the journey of it. So the tone that I chose was to say, this is what I did, and then I did this, and this is how I found this, and this is how I did this. So it's kind of factually stating what I did and showing the research journey, I guess, would be how I chose to do it. Your second question as well about the conversations we have with people that come to archives. I would repeat what Gillian said, and I also think that it's probably on us as the people that work in archives to spend more time making visible the work of archivists, because I think by understanding how the catalogue works, I think it can. I'm not sure if we explain enough about the opinion that the archive takes and how it structures the information. So I think that's something that we could have more conversations about with researchers when they come to speak to us.
Gillian, were you going to say something? Okay. I was, Daniel, one of the things that was common between you and Niraja was also that both of you actually spoke with people who knew or were related to the protagonists which is a huge advantage in one sense. If you're trying, if your principal archive is fragmented or fragmentary and bitty, then it helps, especially if there's someone. And I dare say, in the context of Vittal Kadam, there's a fair amount that you have that relates to his personal sides, including things like, he's asking for a job or looking for a job, and the various people with the conversations are having. I read the letters that you've put on the website, which is not an affluence that Niraja's archive with Hansa Mehta affords in the context of LSE. But Niraja, I was going to ask you one last question, and then we will have our last question, because we really are running short of time now. And that was the question of tone and I'm asking this to you because you began with saying that, I've done a fair amount of historians bashing just now, which I did quite merrily, actually. But there's a certain kind of tone in which historians sort of begin to speak. And I've actually been I've read a lot on Razia for the biography, but I've actually been spending a lot of time writing sketches of how I could possibly begin to write the biography, because it's not just for historians that these biographies are being written, but I'm curious to know, given the kind of writing, the style, your personal style of writing, have you thought about or come to a conclusion about what is the kind of tone you're going to take to write a biography? And that too, one that is based on, fragmented sources?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge, and I haven't yet thought about it. I mean, it's a daunting task. I hope to be able to carry it through, but it's too early to say, how. But you asked me before this about how I decided to take the tone I wanted to take when I was writing about citizenship. And so I'm not a historian, but I'm a little bit of a historian of ideas, at least in the Indian context. And what I did with citizenship and its discontents was actually look at the evolution of the idea of citizenship. Practices, but idea mainly, the evolution of the idea across the 20th century in India. And yes, I did look at some archives. I did look, for instance, the very first book called The Citizen of India. I mean, with the word citizen in the title in the Indian context, was written by an Englishman called William Lee Warner, about whom Nehru had some very unpleasant things to say while he was a student at Cambridge writing to his father, and I think deservedly so, but that's another matter. But Lee Warner wrote this book and then, tried to get it prescribed in schools and colleges and so on, and there's a whole history of that, which I go into a little bit in the book. But essentially, the idea was to look at contestations around the idea of citizenship across the 20th century. And for that, the framing that I chose was looking at various ways in which, or the dominant ways in which you could interpret citizenship. So citizenship as legal status, citizenship as rights, and citizenship as identity. And then within those rubrics, I picked what I was actually going to study. The big limitation, this is not an archival limitation, but this is a limitation which is a sort of broader application, was that I did not have the ability or the expertise to look at literature in Indian languages, right? I have no idea, I still do not know, and no review has pointed out that, you should have looked at X, Y, and Z texts if you were writing a history of citizenship in India. So there's no regional figures, there's no regional debates. It's all India or national level, if you like, English, sort of the medium of debates that I cover are. They're all in English. So there are those limitations, and I don't know if those limitations of language, region, and so on are also reflected in the archives that historians encounter. But then that's a question. Yeah.
Sure, thank you. I'm going to just ask one last question to scholars, which is Antoinette and to Nirja. And that is a comment, Antoinette, that you made again, which was very, very interesting, which was about semi-nonfiction. And that's a very important comment, because I recently published something, well, not recently, last year or the year before, in which I took this up very, very strongly, but I actually took it up in the context of the 1940s and 1950s and history writing about pre-modern, pre-Mughal times in South Asia. And in one sentence, what I was saying was that where scholars confront gaps in archives, there is a historian's vanity and an urge and a compulsion to try and fill up that gap by saying something. So they would actually use words like should, this should have happened, this must have happened, kind of thing. Now, this is very different from other scholarly works where surrounding sources are used to inform the gaps in an archive. But the question of nonfiction or semi-nonfiction is important also because in our contemporary society, there is a lot that is being written that refers to the past and therefore to history with a lowercase h, and that are often flights of fancy, but are put forward as historical, semi-historical narratives. I mean, I'm not talking about fiction and stories of fiction, but I'm talking about things that, non-specialist, but the society and members of society at large read and believe and take forward. So there is a commitment to being rigorous to the archives and to the sources. And as I think I mentioned in an email that I sent to all of you earlier, that it is also about the verifiability of what we put out in the public sphere. But what are both of your thoughts on, or do you have any thoughts about how gaps in archives could be addressed? They don't necessarily have to be filled, I understand, but how could they be addressed? Because one comes across gaps and in certain very crucial points, and just as a methodological query.
Niraja, do you want to take that up?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure, Nilanjan, if you're referring to the sort of the rewriting of history that we currently encounter. I don't know if it was a reference partly at least to that. If so, I mean, so you could have been referring to popular histories, which are different from history rewriting with a political motivation. Okay, and I think the latter is not something that you can settle is not something that can be addressed by addressing the gaps in the archive, because those debates are not taking place at the level of the archive. Those debates are not referring to, they're not actually making claims that attempt to fill in the gaps in the archive. They're simply fantasizing or providing fantastical accounts, alternative accounts of history. And so I don't think that that particular problem can be addressed through a debate about how to plug the gaps in the archive. Frankly, it's not at that level. But if you're thinking of popular history, I know much less about it. I have read a few works of popular history, and most of the ones that I have read have been pretty good in terms of making available to the common reader a sort of accessible accounts, not quite as inventive and creative as the ones that Antoinette mentioned she's done, but making available and accessible to the common reader, whether these are biographies of emperors past or that kind of thing, which actually in their own way do communicate the history that people need to read or have forgotten to read, but it's a separate question from the other one, which is the one about rewriting history, myth, fantasy, and all of those with a political motivation. Separate issue, I think.
Sure. I agree. I should just to clarify what I was saying was I was setting up two parallel streams based on the use of the term semi-nonfiction, and what I was actually trying to put across was that on the one hand, as Antoinette said, there are huge advantages to this kind of history writing, and yet, if it is on any kind of spectrum, then methodologically, one of the challenges is to address the question of gaps in archives, just as one of the empowering tools was another phrase Antoinette used, which was to read diagonally, or which is different from against the grain, as it were.
Yeah.
because Against the Grain was something completely different that we dealt with, 15 years ago. And Nirja, the point you're making is absolutely fine. But what I was saying was, even in attempting to read diagonally and write for a non-specialist public, we are confronted with black holes. And what do we do? Or do we have the ego and the courage to say, I'm sorry, I know only up to 1437, and then I'm going to start from 1465? Because he was clearly around, or she was clearly around in 1465, but I have no clue what happened in the years in between. That is a very important ethical research question. And the farther back you go in time, the more complicated and difficult it becomes, even if you're using inscriptions, even if you're using coins, paintings, etc., etc.
May I come in for a second here before
Yeah, sure.
Which is to say that, yes, I mean, and that's precisely my problem. What did Hansa Mehta do between 1966, when her husband and she returned? He'd been High Commissioner of India in London, and when she came back, I know nothing about what they did or what she did from, let's say, the late 60s till 1995 when she passed. I have interviewed a relative who's told me a little bit about the kind of life she led, which basically sounds like she was watching cricket on television quite a lot, but that can't be the story, right? So yes, I mean, that 1435 and 1465 issue remains in my case. But I wondered what you meant when you said semi-nonfiction. Was it something like that book on, I can't remember the name now, it was by a French author, it was on Nehru and Edwina. Did you mean something like that? I can't remember the name.
No, I was actually, this was a phrase that Antoinette used in the context of the Black history books that she was talking about. But Antoinette, why don't you speak now?
Sure. I mean, I think that that phrase applies to the work of Saidiya Hartman, the work of Taya Miles, where they're trying to use the archives that they have to fill out stories where there are just tremendous gaps. So they're very attached, although also critical of the limits of archives, and writing for it's semi-nonfiction because it's moderately historical, to borrow back from Rebecca Hall. And so I think the fluidity across those categories is really important. I think on the one hand, what we need is more humility about in the face of the fantasy of total knowledge about the historical past that seems to be an inheritance of modernism. I don't know. I mean, I think we just can't know everything. And I think if there's a big hole after 1966 with Hansa, then maybe your biography only goes up to that, because you would have a lot more to say about the period before that, and less to say in ways that make you comfortable, maybe. But I think confessionality about that, transparency about that, is incredibly important and empowering for you as an author, but also engenders trust from the reader, which I think is really important. I guess when you're talking earlier, Lanjan, I was thinking, of course, of Amitav Ghosh, who has perfected this has sliced this space between history and fiction with the Ibis trilogy, which is so well researched. And he does cite historians not through footnotes, but generously in the back of the work. He is deeply immersed in the academic work that many of us have done, but he's adding a kind of flourish and narrative, tremendous narrative skill that evokes a world that the archive could never evoke. But does it pass the test of verifiability? Those probably do, actually, because he is so meticulous and respectful about that boundary line. So I think that's a really great example of and wouldn't we all love to be Amitav Ghosh? We're lucky enough just to be in his universe and to read him, but yes.
Sorry, there's also William Dalrymple, who's trained as a historian, has a PhD as a historian, but writes in a completely different style for a very, very different and more wide-angled audience. But yes, I mean, these are some of the challenges and some of the issues. As Antoinette just said, we really have to know when we have to stop. And I think we have to we have to stop now. I did want to say one thing though, that when I was grappling with this question, and it was about a battle that was in 1565 in the Deccan in India. And I write at one place that I think it is important for historians to know that they may never know. And that's just the truth, that we're just never going to know more than what has been left behind for us to know, or we are able to decipher, which in any case is a minuscule, because the largest part of what happened in history we don't know across world history. But on that note, thank you very much, everyone. This has been an utterly enjoyable discussion. My special thanks to Gillian and to Daniel from the LSE Library for putting together that page. We've worked for a long time to make this event happen, and I do hope that members of the audience and others will visit it and find it useful. So Gillian Murphy and Daniel Payne and Antoinette Burton and Niraja Gopal Jayal. As I always say at the end of all these events, you know, we can never do these events unless all of you give so freely of your expertise, of your time, of your interest, and of your knowledge that make these conversations so animated. But thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye.